Good evening. We begin tonight with an exploration of history's most ruinous patriarchs. Men whose legacies are stained by chaos and whose approach to parenting was a masterclass in dysfunction. These are figures who, by any measure, should have been issued with a public safety warning. So settle in, and as we embark on this journey, feel free to show your support with a subscription if you appreciate this kind of storytelling. I'm always curious to know where my audience is, so drop your location and local time in the comments below. It's a small world, after all. Now, let the ambient noise settle, and let us descend into the past together. King John is infamous as the perpetual antagonist in Robin Hood folklore, but his villainy extended far beyond Sherwood Forest. He was, arguably, the 13th century's most emotionally negligent father, a significant achievement in an age when child-rearing often consisted of little more than shouting and brokering strategic betrothals for toddlers. John claimed the English crown in 1199 and immediately began a systematic campaign of alienating every person of consequence, from his barons to the Pope, and eventually to his own family. His paternal legacy is a toxic cocktail of indifference, greed, and outright criminality. Consider the tragic tale of his nephew, Arthur of Brittany. As a rival claimant to the throne, Arthur was a threat, and John's solution was monstrous. He had the young man captured, imprisoned, and, by most accounts, murdered in captivity. A lesson in parenting. If your method for resolving family disputes involves homicidal incarceration, you may have failed. John's destructive tendencies were not limited to his extended kin. His son, Henry III, was bequeathed a kingdom in such dire financial and political straits that it was the feudal equivalent of a smoldering ruin. Compounding this, John held Henry's mother, his own queen, Isabella of Angoulême, prisoner for over a decade. Nothing establishes a stable home life quite like locking your heir's mother in a castle while you wage and lose foreign wars. He levied taxes so punishing that they drove his nobles to armed revolt, forfeited most of his continental territories in a fit of pique he called a military campaign, and was compelled to sign Magna Carta, a document he promptly disregarded as if it were mere suggestion. To the world, John was a despot. To his children, he was an absentee tyrant with a crown. He offered no guidance, no warmth, no wisdom. He was, in essence, the kind of father who forgets your coronation because he is busy losing a duchy. When we speak of the worst fathers in medieval history, John sets a formidable standard. He didn't just neglect his duties. He turned fatherhood into an instrument of state collapse. Ivan IV of Russia, known as the Terrible, was not merely a poor parent. He was a cataclysmic one. His reign, which began in the 16th century, started with promise and reform, but by the time his sons were grown, he had descended into a maelstrom of paranoia and violence. His rule became defined by purges, a secret police force known as the Oprichniki, and what can only be described as a complete psychological unraveling. He had several children, but his bond with his eldest son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, was a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. The younger Ivan was capable and respected, qualities his father interpreted as signs of a threat. The relationship reached its horrifying climax in 1581. The elder Ivan, in a fit of rage, assaulted his pregnant daughter-in-law for her supposedly immodest attire. When his son confronted him, the argument escalated until the Tsar, wielding his heavy royal scepter, struck his heir a fatal blow to the head. A famous painting captures the aftermath. Ivan, his eyes wide with a dawning, soul-shattering horror, cradling his dying son. It was a moment of terrible clarity, a realization that perhaps not bludgeoning your children with metal objects was a superior parenting strategy. This act was not just filicide, it was political suicide. Ivan's remaining heir was unfit to rule, and his death paved the way for the time of troubles. a period of anarchy and famine that nearly destroyed Russia. The Tsar's subsequent guilt only deepened his cruelty, and he spent his final years consumed by psychopathy until his death in 1584, reportedly during a game of chess. In the annals of dreadful fathers, Ivan earns top marks for melodrama and a complete and utter failure in paternal responsibility. Peter of Castile, who carried the epithets the cruel and the just, depending on who you asked, ensured his children learned two fundamental truths: trust no one, and family dinners could end in homicide. Ruling Castile in the mid-14th century, Peter's reign was a volatile mix of shrewd political maneuvering and sudden, brutal violence. He was a man who could plot your downfall over a chessboard and then carry it out with his own dagger. His parenting style could be described as strategic neglect. He fathered a multitude of illegitimate children, treating them less as heirs and more as disposable political assets. Each child was a lottery ticket that might yield an alliance, or, just as easily, a pretext for war. His most defining parental failure, however, was his all-consuming war against his half-brother, Henry of Trastamara. Peter saw Henry as the source of all his problems and pursued his destruction with relentless fury. This family feud was not confined to the battlefield. In a chilling act of treachery, Peter murdered another half-brother, Frederick, during a supposed reconciliation, stabbing him personally. This act sent a clear message to his own children. They were pawns in his brutal game. In the end, his children were left disinherited, imprisoned, or used as political bargaining chips by his enemies. The throne ultimately went to the very man he spent his life trying to destroy, his half-brother Henry. Peter of Castile didn't just fail at fatherhood. He made it a blood sport where his own children were the first casualties. Emperor Basil I of the Byzantine Empire had a remarkable story of ascent, rising from a humble peasant in 9th century Macedonia to the imperial throne. However, his journey from the stables to the palace was paved with intrigue, murder, and a profoundly dysfunctional family dynamic. Basil's rise began when he caught the eye of Emperor Michael III, becoming his confidant and co-ruler. This partnership ended abruptly when Basil orchestrated Michael's assassination in his bedchamber, seizing sole control of the empire. This act of regicide set the stage for his troubled fatherhood. His relationship with his supposed son, Leo V, was a masterclass in psychological abuse. Basil was plagued by doubts about Leo's legitimacy, as Leo was born while the Empress was still close to the murdered Michael III. Consequently, Basil raised the boy with a toxic blend of suspicion and emotional coldness, treating him not as a son, but as a potential usurper. He undermined Leo at every turn, questioned his parentage publicly, and made his life a waking nightmare of imperial paranoia. When Leo showed an interest in learning, Basil restricted his access to books. When Leo's closest advisor gained influence, Basil had him tortured. By the time Basil died in a bizarre hunting accident, Leo's grief was reportedly Basil the Great may have built an empire, but he utterly failed to build a relationship with his son, leaving behind a legacy of trauma and mistrust. Philip IV of France, called the Fair for his handsome features rather than his temperament, was a monarch of cold, calculating efficiency, ruling in the late 13th and early 14th centuries. His court was a place of rigid discipline, where emotional displays were viewed as a sign of weakness. He raised his 4 children, 3 sons and a daughter, with the same detached severity he applied to statecraft. They were provided with tutors and titles, but affection was a currency Philip did not possess. His true entry into the Hall of Terrible Fathers, however, is the Tour de Nesle affair, a scandal that shattered the royal family. His daughter, Isabella, married to Edward II of England, reported that her sisters-in-law, the wives of Philip's sons, were engaged in adulterous affairs with 2 knights. Philip's reaction was swift and merciless. He had the knights brutally tortured and publicly executed. The princesses were imprisoned, with one dying in captivity and another's fate remaining suspiciously obscure. The scandal publicly humiliated his sons and exposed the moral rot at the heart of his court. Philip's response was not to comfort his family or mend the damage, but to retreat further into his cold, administrative shell. All three of his sons went on to become kings, but their reigns were short and largely disastrous, a testament to the fact that children raised in an emotional, deep freeze rarely grow into effective leaders. Charles VI of France began his reign as the beloved, a handsome and popular king. He ended it as the Mad, a title that was tragically accurate. Midway through his rule, Charles began suffering from severe mental breakdowns. The most infamous episode occurred in 1392, when he suddenly attacked his own retinue in a forest, killing several men before he could be subdued. His episodes became more frequent and bizarre. He would forget his own name, his family, and his role as king. At one point, he suffered from the delusion that he was made of glass and would shatter if touched. Charles had 12 children, but during his long periods of psychosis, he often failed to recognize them, with their father effectively absent and their mother, Isabeau of Bavaria. Consumed by the struggle to maintain control, the royal children became pawns in a vicious power struggle between court factions. They were moved about, married off in desperate political gambits, and left to navigate a world of betrayal and chaos. His son, the future Charles VII, grew up in a kingdom torn apart by the 100 Years' War, with his own father offering nothing but a vacant stare. Charles VI's tragedy was not one of cruelty but of absence. His mental illness created a power vacuum that engulfed his children, leaving them to inherit a fractured and leaderless kingdom. Edward I of England, known as Longshanks, was a formidable king who ruled with an iron fist. He was a man of conquest and discipline, famous for subjugating Wales, warring with Scotland, and building imposing castles as monuments to his power. His approach to fatherhood was similarly rigid and uncompromising. His son and heir, the future Edward II, was everything his father was not: artistic, sensitive, and more interested in music and companionship than in warfare. This fundamental clash of personalities defined their relationship. Edward I was not merely disappointed in his son. He was actively hostile toward his character. He openly disdained Edward II's close friendships, particularly with Piers Gaveston, whom he exiled. He threatened to disinherit his son, publicly, humiliated him, and treated him with a cold contempt that bordered on emotional abuse. Their relationship was a constant power struggle, with the father attempting to forge his son into a mirror image of himself and failing spectacularly. On his deathbed, Edward I's final wish was not one of paternal affection but of military command. He ordered his bones to be carried into battle against the Scots. After his father's death, Edward II ascended the throne and proceeded to fail in every way his father had feared, ultimately being overthrown and murdered. Edward I was a successful king, but a disastrous father, whose inability to accept his son for who he was contributed to the ruin of his own dynasty. John of Bohemia was a 14th-century king who treated his kingdom as a home base and the rest of Europe as his personal playground. He was a chivalric knight, a crusader, and a thrill-seeker, who seemed to believe that fatherhood primarily involved bestowing a title upon your children and leaving them to deal with the consequences of your adventures. He spent the majority of his reign outside of Bohemia, fighting in campaigns across the continent for honor, politics, or simply the thrill of battle. He left his son, the future Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV, to be raised by others while he gallivanted across Europe. John's legacy as a father is perfectly encapsulated by his death at the Battle of Crécy in 1346. By this time, he was completely blind. Rather than retire, he had himself tied to his horse between two other knights and charged headlong into the English lines, seeking a final blaze of glory. He found it, dying in a hail of arrows. He left his son to inherit a kingdom racked by conflict. with no guidance and the impossibly dramatic legacy of a father who chose a glorious death over responsible rule. Charles IV would go on to become one of history's great rulers, a success made all the more remarkable by the fact that he had to overcome the complete lack of paternal guidance provided by his reckless father. William the Conqueror, famed for his victory at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, was as skilled at creating a dysfunctional family as he was at building a kingdom. An illegitimate son who fought his way to power, William ruled with a will of iron and an apparent inability to show affection. He and his wife, Matilda, had 4 sons, all of whom coveted the power he wielded. His relationship with his eldest son and heir, Robert Curthose, was particularly fraught. Robert was ambitious and rebellious, and William responded not with guidance, but with force. When Robert demanded more power, William refused, leading his son to rebel. In response, William laid siege to his son's castle, a medieval equivalent of a particularly harsh grounding. During one confrontation, Robert actually wounded his father in combat before realizing his identity. The resulting rift never fully healed. Upon his death, William awkwardly divided his lands, giving Normandy to Robert and England to his second son, William Rufus. This division predictably sparked years of civil war between the brothers, a brutal conflict fueled by the unresolved tensions their father had fostered. William the Conqueror successfully built a kingdom, but he utterly failed to build a family, leaving behind a legacy of fratricidal chaos. Charles, the bold Duke of Burgundy, was a man who lived up to his name, governing with a dramatic and reckless flair that extended to his parenting. He inherited a vast and wealthy domain and had 1 child, a daughter named Mary. His approach to fatherhood was a mix of intense, dynastic ambition and near-total neglect of her practical education. Obsessed with forging a new kingdom for himself, he poured all his energy into a series of disastrous wars against his neighbors, including France and the Swiss Confederacy. He envisioned a grand Burgundian state for Mary to inherit, but he was too reckless to secure it. His ambitions ended at the Battle of Nancy in 1477, where he was killed, his body left to be partially eaten by wolves, a grim postscript to any paternal legacy. His daughter, Mary, only 19 years old, was left to face the consequences. With no training and her father's enemies circling, she was forced into a marriage with the Habsburgs to protect her inheritance, a move that plunged Burgundy into centuries of conflict. Charles the Bold didn't leave his daughter a kingdom. He left her a catastrophic mess and a host of powerful enemies. He is remembered not as a kingmaker, but as a cautionary tale. Alfonso XI of Castile was a 14th century king who excelled on the battlefield but created a domestic disaster that would haunt his kingdom for generations. While married to Maria of Portugal, his true affections lay with his mistress, Leonor de Guzman, with whom he fathered 10 illegitimate children. Alfonso did not hide his second family. He flaunted them, bestowing titles and estates upon Leonor and her sons while his legitimate queen and heir were sidelined. He treated his illegitimate children with a favoritism that bordered on obsession. The problem came to a head after Alfonso's death from the Black Plague in 1350. His legitimate son, Peter, ascended the throne, filled with resentment over his father's behavior. One of his first acts as king was to have his father's beloved mistress, Leonor, arrested and executed. This ignited a brutal civil war between Peter and his 10 half-brothers, a conflict directly caused by their father's inability to manage his personal and political affairs. Alfonso XI was not a cruel father, but his blatant favoritism and poor judgment sowed the seeds of a conflict that would tear his kingdom apart, proving that a king's personal failings can have devastating public consequences. Richard the Lion is a legendary figure of the Third Crusade, a king whose reputation for martial prowess far outshone his interest in governance or family. Crowned in 1189, he spent the vast majority of his reign outside of England, pursuing glory in the Holy Land. His approach to fatherhood was one of complete and total neglect. Though married to Berengaria of Navarre, he produced no legitimate heirs, showing little interest in his wife or the continuation of his line. He did have one acknowledged illegitimate son, Philip of Cognac, but offered him no titles, no lands, and no future, effectively erasing him from the historical record. Richard's failings as a family man extended to his other relationships. He rebelled against his own father, Henry II, constantly vied with his brothers for power, and drained the English treasury to fund his military ambitions, and later his own ransom. He treated his kingdom like a personal bank account to be emptied for his adventures, leaving his brother John to deal with the economic fallout. Though he never raised children in a conventional sense, he failed in his paternal duty to his people and his family, leaving behind a legacy of financial ruin and a power vacuum that contributed to the instability of his brother's reign. He was a great warrior, but an utterly absent father, more concerned with his own legend than with any form of lasting responsibility. Louis XI of France was a 15th-century monarch who ruled with a combination of paranoia, cunning, and profound emotional detachment. Known as the Universal Spider, he wove a complex web of espionage and intrigue to centralize his power. His only surviving son, the future Charles VIII, was raised not as an heir but as a potential threat. Fearing a challenge to his authority, Louis had his son raised in isolation, away from the royal court, and provided him with a minimal education designed to keep him dependent. Louis did not want a successor, he wanted a puppet. He denied Charles any role in governance, and kept him under constant surveillance. Even on his deathbed, Louis refused to relinquish control, attempting to rule through a flurry of letters and decrees, leaving his unprepared teenage son terrified and ill-equipped to rule. When Charles VIII finally took the throne, his lack of experience and political acumen led to a series of disastrous military and political decisions. Louis XI was a brilliant, if ruthless, king, but as a father, he was a study in pathological mistrust, raising a son who was a stranger to him and a danger to the kingdom he had worked so hard to build. Charles II of England, the merry monarch, was a king who embraced pleasure and avoided responsibility with equal enthusiasm. After being restored to the throne in 1660, he presided over a court known for its lavish parties, wit, and moral laxity. While he failed to produce a legitimate heir with his wife, Catherine of Braganza, he fathered at least 12 illegitimate children with a variety of mistresses. His approach to parenting was to acknowledge his offspring, bestow upon them titles and wealth, and then leave them to their own devices. Charles treated fatherhood as a hobby rather than a duty. He was a charming but distant figure in his children's lives, more a source of status and income than a paternal guide. His casual approach to his lineage had real consequences. One of his most favored illegitimate sons, James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, launched a rebellion to claim the throne, a bid that ended with his execution. Charles II was a king who prioritized personal enjoyment above all else. His legacy as a father reflects this, a sprawling, chaotic family tree held together by titles and charm, but devoid of any real guidance or responsibility. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, was a monarch who ruled with an absolute and suffocating authority that extended to his own family. He reigned for 72 years, a period in which he transformed the French monarchy into a symbol of divine power, with himself at its center. He had one legitimate son and numerous illegitimate children, all of whom were raised in the opulent but stifling environment of the Palace of Versailles. Louis was not an absent father. He was an omnipresent one, controlling every aspect of his children's lives. His legitimate heir, the Grand Dauphin, was never entrusted with any real power or responsibility. Louis systematically undermined his son, ensuring that he remained a subordinate figure, forever in the shadow of the Sun King. The Dauphin died before his father, as did his own son, leaving the throne to a great-grandson, who had also been raised under Louis's domineering gaze. His illegitimate children were used as strategic pawns, married off to secure alliances and solidify his control over the nobility. Louis XIV was not a cruel father in the conventional sense, but his suffocating control and refusal to share power created a dynasty of weak and unprepared heirs, a legacy of gilded impotence that would contribute to the eventual downfall of the French monarchy. Long before the advent of modern meteorology, the ancient Babylonians looked to the heavens for clues about the weather, understanding that their survival depended on it. In the Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the success of agriculture was inextricably linked to the ability to anticipate floods, droughts, and storms. Babylonian priests, acting as the world's first systematic meticulously recorded celestial phenomena on thousands of cuneiform tablets. These were not mere superstitions. They were vast archives of observational data collected over generations. These priests documented the appearance of clouds, the timing of lightning strikes, and the behavior of celestial bodies, searching for patterns that connected events in the sky with outcomes on the ground. A certain type of cloud formation in the west might presage a flood. Thunder from a specific direction could be an omen of war or famine. They performed their observations from atop massive ziggurats, temple towers, that provided an unobstructed view of the horizon. While their interpretations were framed in a religious context, believing the weather to be a message from the gods, their methods were rooted in empirical observation. They were, in essence, practicing a form of probabilistic forecasting, building a system of knowledge that linked celestial cause to terrestrial effect. To the Babylonians, the weather was a matter of divine will, but it was a will that could be understood through careful and patient observation. For the ancient Egyptians, the most critical weather event was the annual inundation of the Nile River. This flood was the lifeblood of their civilization, depositing fertile silt that made agriculture possible in the desert. The timing of the flood was crucial. Too early or too late, and the entire harvest could be lost. To predict its arrival, the Egyptians turned their gaze to the stars, specifically to the heliacal rising of Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky. Each year, Sirius would reappear on the eastern horizon just before dawn, and this celestial event served as a precise harbinger of the coming flood. This discovery was the result of centuries of meticulous observation by Egyptian priests who tracked stellar movements from temple observatories. Their work was not abstract astronomy. It was a practical necessity for survival. The rising of Sirius marked the beginning of the Egyptian New Year and was deeply embedded in their mythology. The goddess Isis was said to weep tears into the Nile, causing it to flood, and Sirius, known to them as Sopdot, was her celestial manifestation. The Egyptians developed a 365-day solar calendar based on these observations, a system that allowed them to predict the annual cycle with remarkable accuracy. They measured the height of the flood using nilometers, stone gauges, placed in the river, allowing them to anticipate the success of the harvest. In ancient Egypt, the weather was not forecast. It was read in the cosmic dance between a star, a river, and the gods. In the high Andes Mountains, where the weather is harsh and unpredictable, ancient communities developed unique methods of forecasting that were deeply intertwined with their environment. Lacking the clear year-round view of the stars available to other civilizations, they learned to read the signs in the world around them, including the behavior of animals. Farmers in the Andean highlands paid close attention to llamas, alpacas, and other creatures, believing they could sense subtle environmental shifts. The restlessness of guinea pigs might signal an approaching storm, while changes in the grazing habits of llamas could indicate a coming cold snap. This meteorology was combined with other forms of observation. The Andean people studied the dark clouds of the Milky Way, vast dust clouds that created silhouettes against the stars, believing their shape and clarity could predict rainfall. They monitored the snow line on the mountains and practiced a form of ritual negotiation with the weather. Through offerings to the earth's spirits they believed controlled it. Their worldview was based on a principle of reciprocity with nature, a belief that one must listen and respond to the environment rather than attempt to dominate it. For these communities, survival depended on this intimate and holistic understanding of the land, the sky, and the creatures that inhabited them. In ancient China, the weather was seen as a direct reflection of cosmic balance. The emperor, as the son of heaven, was responsible for maintaining harmony between the earthly and celestial realms. Natural disasters like droughts or floods were not just unfortunate events, they were signs of a spiritual imbalance that could threaten the emperor's mandate to rule. Chinese weather prediction was a sophisticated blend of empirical observation and philosophical principles, primarily the theory of the 5 elements: wood, fire, earth, metal, water, and the interplay of yin and yang. Chinese scholars and astronomers kept meticulous records of weather patterns dating back to the Shang dynasty, when oracle bones were used to divine everything from military campaigns to the likelihood of rain. They developed a complex classification system for clouds, associating them with celestial dragons who controlled the rains. Early meteorological instruments, such as wind vanes and rudimentary rain gauges, were developed centuries before their European counterparts. When weather-related disasters struck, they were seen as a failure of the ruler, a sign that heaven had withdrawn its favor, which could lead to political unrest and rebellion. In China, predicting the weather was not just an agricultural necessity, it was a fundamental pillar of political legitimacy. In ancient Greece, a shift began to occur in the understanding of weather, moving from purely divine explanations toward a more rational, naturalistic approach. While Zeus was still seen as the wielder of thunderbolts, early philosophers like Anaximander and Aristotle began to propose that weather phenomena could be explained by natural laws. Aristotle's Meteorologica was a groundbreaking attempt to classify and explain weather based on the interactions of the 4 elements: air, water, earth, and fire. Though many of his conclusions were incorrect, his methodology based on observation and logical deduction was revolutionary. Alongside these philosophical inquiries, Greek farmers and sailors relied on practical, calendar-based knowledge passed down through generations. Hesiod's Works and Days, an ancient poetic almanac, provided farmers with a guide to planting and harvesting based on seasonal signs, such as the migration of cranes or the rising of certain constellations. Sailors learned to navigate by the predictable patterns of winds, like the Etesians in the Aegean Sea, while omens and divine explanations still held sway. Particularly in rural areas, the Greeks made a crucial intellectual leap, advancing the idea that nature could be studied and understood through reason, laying the groundwork for the development of Western science. In ancient India, the rhythm of life was dictated by the monsoon, a seasonal weather pattern that brought the rains necessary for agriculture. The ability to predict the arrival and intensity of the monsoon was a matter of life and death. The earliest Indian weather lore is found in the Vedas, sacred texts that encode generations of observational knowledge within their hymns and rituals. The Vedic deity Indra, the god of storms, was seen as the bringer of the monsoon rains. But the ancient seers were also keen observers of the natural world. They divided the year into 6 seasons, or ritus, each associated with specific environmental changes. Farmers learned to read the signs of the approaching monsoon in the blooming of certain flowers, the migration of birds, and the behavior of insects. Later texts, such as the Brihat Samhita, by the 6th century scholar Varahamihira, compiled this knowledge into a systematic framework, blending astronomy, astrology, and environmental cues to forecast the weather. This deep, cyclical understanding of the environment allowed ancient Indian civilization to live in harmony with the powerful forces of the monsoon, timing their agriculture, festivals, and even royal decisions to its predictable, yet powerful rhythm. across the diverse landscapes of North America. Indigenous peoples developed highly localized and sophisticated systems of weather prediction based on an intimate relationship with their environment. From the Great Plains to the Pacific Northwest, these systems were essential for survival, guiding hunting, farming, and seasonal migrations. There was no single method. Each tribe's knowledge was tailored to its specific ecosystem. Plains tribes, like the Lakota, observed the behavior of buffalo herds to anticipate storms, while the Hopi of the Southwest relied on a combination of astronomical observation and the behavior of insects to predict rainfall and guide their corn planting. In the Pacific Northwest, coastal tribes like the Tlingit and Haida read the signs in the sea, observing the color of the water, the movement of fish, and the patterns of fog. This observational knowledge was deeply integrated with their spiritual beliefs and was passed down through oral traditions, songs, and ceremonies. This was not weather prediction in the modern scientific sense. It was a form of weather relationship, a holistic worldview that saw humans, animals, and the sky as interconnected parts of a living system. For these communities, survival depended on their ability to listen to the language of the land. The ancient Polynesians were master navigators who developed one of the most remarkable systems of weather forecasting in human history. Sailing thousands of miles across the open Pacific in canoes, their survival depended on their ability to read the subtle language of the ocean and the sky. Polynesian navigators, trained from childhood, could detect an approaching storm not from dark clouds, but from minute changes in the pattern of ocean swells. They used the formation of clouds over distant islands to locate land and anticipate local weather conditions. Their knowledge of the stars was encyclopedic, and they used celestial movements not only for navigation but also to predict seasonal weather shifts, such as the approach of the cyclone season. This vast body of knowledge was not written down but was encoded in chants, songs, and oral histories. Polynesian navigators did not conquer the ocean. They moved in harmony with it, treating the natural world as a partner rather than an adversary. Their methods represent an extraordinary feat of human observation and a testament to the power of a deep, intuitive connection with the environment. As we look back at these ancient systems of weather forecasting, from the clay tablets of Babylon to the star charts of Polynesia, we see a common thread, an intimate, respectful, and deeply personal relationship with the natural world. These civilizations did not see themselves as separate from their environment. They were a part of it. Their methods, while rooted in what we might call myth or religion, were also based on generations of careful observation and a profound understanding of the cyclical rhythms of nature. Modern meteorology, with its satellites and supercomputers, can predict the weather with astonishing accuracy, but it has, perhaps, lost something of the ancient sense of attunement. In an age of climate crisis, there is a lesson to be learned from our ancestors, that survival depends not just on knowing the weather, but on belonging to it. By 44 BCE, Gaius Julius Caesar stood at the apex of the Roman world, a figure of immense power and profound danger. He had risen from a position of relative obscurity to become the undisputed master of Rome. His path to power paved with military genius, political cunning, and an unshakable self-belief. His conquest of Gaul had made him a legend, and his subsequent victory in a brutal civil war against his rival Pompey had left him without any serious opposition. He returned to Rome not as a general, but as a de facto king, accepting the title of dictator in perpetuity, a term that sent a chill down the spine of the Roman aristocracy. Caesar embarked on a series of sweeping reforms, reorganizing the calendar, expanding the Senate with his own loyalists, and extending citizenship to provincials. To the common people, he was a populist hero. To the traditionalist senators, he was a tyrant in the making. They watched with growing alarm as he adopted the symbols of monarchy, a purple toga, a golden chair in the Senate, and a cult of personality that bordered on deification. When his lieutenant, Mark Antony, publicly offered him a crown, Caesar's theatrical refusal did little to assuage their fears. For many, it was clear that the Roman Republic, founded on the overthrow of kings 5 centuries earlier, was on the verge of being dismantled by one man's ambition. While Caesar enjoyed his unprecedented power, a conspiracy was taking shape. In the shadows, the plot was not the work of radicals, but of respected members of the Roman elite, led by the stern and ambitious Gaius Cassius Longinus. The key to their plan, however, was the recruitment of Marcus Junius Brutus, a man whose lineage traced back to the founder of the Republic. Brutus was a figure of great moral authority, and his involvement would lend the assassination an air of patriotic duty rather than treason. Brutus, who had been pardoned and favored by Caesar after the Civil War, wrestled with his conscience, torn between personal loyalty and his devotion to the Republic. Ultimately, his sense of civic duty prevailed. The conspiracy grew to include over 60 senators, all united by the belief that Caesar's rule was an existential threat to Rome. They resolved to act before Caesar departed on a new military campaign, choosing the Ides of March, March 15th, as the date for the assassination. The chosen location was the theater of Pompey, where the Senate was to convene. The conspirators planned to use daggers, concealed beneath their togas, to strike a swift and symbolic blow against the man they saw as a tyrant. They believed they were acting to save the Republic, but they were about to unleash a storm of chaos and violence that would consume it entirely. The morning of the Ides of March was thick with an atmosphere of dread. Omens and portents were said to have occurred, and Caesar's wife Calpurnia reportedly had a nightmare of his death, begging him to stay home. He was initially persuaded, but one of the conspirators, Decimus Brutus, convinced him that to miss the Senate meeting would be seen as a sign of weakness. Caesar relented and made his way to the theater of Pompey, fatefully ignoring a written warning of the plot that was handed to him along the way. As Caesar took his seat in the Senate chamber, the conspirators surrounded him, feigning a petition. The signal was given, and the attack began. The first blow was clumsy, but it was quickly followed by a frenzy of stabbing as senators swarmed around him, their daggers flashing. Caesar was stabbed 23 times. According to legend, his resistance ceased when he saw Brutus among his attackers. His supposed final words, "Et tu, Brute, you too, Brutus," becoming an immortal symbol of betrayal. When the violence subsided, Julius Caesar lay dead at the base of a statue of his great rival Pompey. The assassins believed they had liberated Rome. In the immediate aftermath of the assassination, the conspirators were met not with celebration, but with stunned silence and then panic. Senators fled the chamber in terror, and the assassins, their hands still bloody, found themselves isolated. Outside, the Roman people, who had revered Caesar as their champion, reacted with growing anger. The assassins had a plan to kill a man, but no plan for what came next. They had created a power vacuum, and into it stepped Mark Antony, Caesar's co-consul and loyal lieutenant. Antony brokered a tense truce, agreeing not to prosecute the assassins in exchange for the ratification of Caesar's acts. But the situation remained volatile. The reading of Caesar's will revealed that he had adopted his grandnephew, the young Octavian, as his heir, and had left a generous sum of money to every Roman citizen. This news further inflamed public opinion against the assassins. The people were in mourning, the conspirators were on the defensive, and two ambitious men, Antony and Octavian, were poised to exploit the chaos. The Ides of March had not saved the Republic. It had merely set the stage for its final bloody demise. The turning point came at Caesar's funeral. Mark Antony, in a masterstroke of political theater, delivered a funeral oration that transformed public grief into a revolutionary rage. He read Caesar's will to the crowd, reminding them of their leader's generosity. He then held up Caesar's blood-stained toga, pointing to the rents made by the conspirators' daggers. The crowd, already simmering with anger, erupted into a riot. They built a makeshift pyre in the Forum and cremated Caesar's body, the flames of their anger spreading throughout the city. The mob hunted the conspirators, who were forced to flee Rome for their lives. Antony emerged as the de facto leader of the city, his power cemented by the popular outrage he had so skillfully manipulated. Meanwhile, Caesar's young heir, Octavian, arrived in Rome to claim his inheritance, a move that would set him on a collision course with Antony. The funeral had not brought closure, it had ignited a civil war. Caesar was dead, but his legacy, now armed and vengeful, would go on to shape the future of Rome. The years following Caesar's death were marked by a complex and brutal power struggle. The young and underestimated Octavian proved to be a political prodigy, quickly winning the support of Caesar's veterans and a portion of the Senate. Unable to defeat each other, Octavian and Antony formed an uneasy alliance with another of Caesar's former generals, Lepidus. This second triumvirate was a legalized three-man dictatorship, and their first order of business was to eliminate their political enemies through a series of brutal proscriptions. With their power consolidated in Rome, they turned their attention to the assassins, Brutus and Cassius, who had amassed an army in the east. In 42 BCE, the two sides met at the Battle of Philippi in Greece. The Republican forces were defeated, and both Brutus and Cassius committed suicide. The victory at Philippi marked the end of the Roman Republic as a functioning political entity. With their common enemy defeated, the alliance between Antony and Octavian began to fracture. The final act of the drama played out as a struggle between two men and two visions of the Roman world. Antony, based in the east, became entangled with Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt. Octavian, in Rome, launched a brilliant propaganda campaign, portraying Antony as a decadent, orientalized despot who had betrayed his Roman heritage. In 31 BCE, their forces clashed at the naval battle of Actium. Antony and Cleopatra were defeated and subsequently took their own lives. Octavian returned to Rome as the sole, undisputed master of the Roman world. In 27 BCE, he was granted the title Augustus, and while he maintained the facade of the Republic, he had, in fact, become its first emperor. The daggers that were meant to save the Republic had, ironically, cleared the path for its transformation into an empire. Julius Caesar's death was not the end of an era, but the bloody birth of a new one. Tokugawa Ieyasu was born in 1543, into the chaos of Japan's warring states period, a time of relentless conflict and shifting alliances. As the heir to the minor Metsudra clan, he was a pawn in the power games of his more powerful neighbors. At the age of 6, he was sent as a political hostage to the Imagawa clan, a common practice to secure alliances. His early life was defined by captivity, first under the Oda clan, who intercepted his convoy, and later under the Imagawa. This experience did not break him, it forged him. He learned the arts of war, diplomacy, and, most importantly, patience. He learned to observe, to wait, and to survive. His opportunity came in 1560 at the Battle of Okayazama, where the Imagawa clan was decisively defeated by the rising warlord Oda Nobunaga. In the ensuing chaos, Ieyasu seized his ancestral castle and declared his independence. He made the pragmatic decision to ally himself with the formidable Nobunaga, a partnership that would last for 2 decades, while Nobunaga expanded his power. With brutal efficiency, Ieyasu focused on consolidating his own domain, building a stable and loyal power base. He was cautious, deliberate, and always playing the long game. When Nobunaga was assassinated in 1582, Japan was once again plunged into turmoil. The man who emerged to fill the power vacuum was Toyotomi Hideyoshi, another of Nobunaga's former retainers. Ieyasu chose not to challenge Hideyoshi directly, instead opting to become his nominal vassal while continuing to build his own strength. He served Hideyoshi with outward loyalty, all the while positioning himself as a stable and reliable figure. When Hideyoshi died in 1598, leaving a young son as his heir, Ieyasu was the most powerful member of the Council of Regents appointed to govern. The stage was set for his final move. The inevitable conflict came in 1600 at the Battle of Sekigahara. Ieyasu led the Eastern Army against a coalition of loyalists to the Toyotomi cause, led by Ishida. The battle was the largest and most decisive in Japanese history, but it was won not just by force, but by Ieyasu's masterful use of deception and psychological warfare. He had secretly negotiated with several of the opposing commanders, and, at a crucial moment in the battle, their betrayal led to the collapse of the Western Army. The victory at Sekigahara left Ieyasu as the undisputed master of Japan. In 1603, he was appointed shogun, the military ruler of the country. He established his capital in Edo, modern-day Tokyo, and set about creating a new political order. He implemented a strict social hierarchy, a centralized bureaucracy, and the Senkin-katai system, which required regional lords to spend alternating years in Edo, effectively keeping them as hostages and draining their resources. To eliminate the final threat to his rule, he launched a campaign against Hideyoshi's son, Hideyori, besieging him in Osaka Castle in 1615. The castle fell, and the Toyotomi line was extinguished. Tokugawa Ieyasu died in 1616, but the system he created endured. The Tokugawa shogunate would rule Japan for over 250 years, a period of unprecedented peace and stability known as the Edo period. Japan was largely closed off from the outside world, and its society was rigidly controlled, but the constant warfare of the previous centuries was over. Ieyasu's legacy is one of patience, pragmatism, and iron-willed determination. The boy who began his life as a hostage ended it as the architect of a new Japan, a testament to the power of waiting for the right moment to strike.